In this next tutorial, what we're going to do is create a outdoor exterior HDRI lit shot with a backplate that we use from the asset manager here. So what we'll do straight away is head to the asset manager, and we'll go into the VRED assets 2022 and head to the environments tab, and then we're going to find this HDRI which I like. I think it's in London, this one. And we're just going to add to the scene. And straight away you can see it's loaded in nice and quickly. And you have, yeah, I think this is a bridge in London. I think in the background you can see the Tower Bridge. And there's the shard. So we're going to, add the car in here with the scene plate. So what we'll do now is then again we'll open the asset manager after I closed it. Where is it? It's here, and then we go to scene plates, and then we're just going to find the correct scene plate for this, which is here, and then we'll add add it to scene plate editor. So now we'll go to our scene plates and turn it on. As you can see, we still have the old one that we used previously, so I'm just going to go to my scene plate editor and turn this one off, and then we have our scene plate. So I'm just going to quickly check the EXIF data. And again, there is none, so we have the width and the height here, so we know which aspect ratio we're working with, and we can then sort of try and find a nice angle for the car once we have the EXIF data. So I think the way I did this, I went to the web shop, and it's a domable one, and here's the information for the focal length. So it's 50mm, so we can already set our perspective camera to 50mm, and then we can start to play around with finding a nice angle and things like this. But one thing I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use the perspective match tool. So we head over to the perspective camera, to the advanced tab, and then to perspective match, and once we press perspective match, we'll get a bunch of lines, blue, red and green. So this is you'll see that the blue is the vertical axis, the red is horizontal, and then this one is heading off into the more perspective line. So what we can do now is use these sort of lines on the ground to line up the perspective lines, so we can match the green ones with the path and the lines on the road, and we can match the blue ones with the building in the background. The lines are pretty straightforward, and you can see they're pretty much already there. This blue one needs to change a little bit, and then we can take our red ones and also use again the lines in the building to sort of match this. And don't worry if the camera is going a bit wonky, it won't matter in the end. So it would be something like this, and we can then turn here and then sort of move our camera around. And if we check our camera, I think maybe the focal length will be not 100% correct, so we can then change that, make it 50, and then we can sort of play around here and see how that looks. And I think maybe there'll be a little bit of roll, so we can perhaps play around with this a little bit and just sort of dial it in so it kind of matches, and maybe we can turn on our grid. And I think that's looking pretty good for now. And so now we can align our HDRI so the sun is in the correct spot. Turn off our grid, and I know this is in London, and so technically this car is driving on the wrong side of the road. So, but for this purpose, I like the rear of the car. It looks pretty cool. So, and I don't think any builder noticed. So we can go with this. So what we'll do is we'll turn our scene plate off, and then we'll go into our materials, and then actually what we'll do first is go back into our camera, turn off perspective match, go to our track, and then just create a new viewpoint. And then what we'll do is head into our environment. Because it's an asset, we need to right click, select, and then we can find it and modify it. So we can change the options, and we'll head down to our rotation and sort of bring that round so it's sort of similar to where the back plate is, and if you look at the exposure you can see also where the sun is, and we can use that sort of later to get an idea with our shadows and things like this. So for now I'll just leave this at 2 or maybe 1.5, and then I'll turn our scene plate on and let this render for a little while. So as you can see, things don't quite match up, sort of the shadow contact on the ground, the shadow color, and also the sort of the color of the car. So what we'll do here is we'll go back into our camera, and then we'll go into our perspective, and then image processing, and then find color correction, and then you can just play around and make this a bit warmer to sort of match with the back plate, because it's a warm sunny day. And yeah, we can play around with that a little bit, just dial it in. And one thing we can do as well, we can create a cylinder. So what I want to do is make sure we're on our root, and then we'll go to our scene and geometry, create a cylinder, and then we'll change the height to something like, I don't know, 5 meters maybe, and we'll just rotate this, and I'll use the transform tool. So we want this one here, 90, and then we want to maybe back to 90, and then sort of bring this back here to where the lamppost is and sort of line it up. And what we use that for in a little while is to get, so we know the correct sun direction, and we'll create a light to, you know, give a harder shadow similar to what you see here on the lamppost and, you know, the fence in the background, so we get sort of the right sun direction. So I think now we can fine-tune our HDRI a little bit to sort of maybe match up with the backplate, so you know the sun is more in the same direction. Obviously these pictures probably weren't taken exactly the same time, so the sun does move obviously throughout the day, and even in sort of 10-15 minutes, you know, the light or the sun area will change. So what we'll do is go to our materials tab and then just find our sphere. We'll turn off the scene plate button, and then what we'll do is just sort of rotate this a little bit more so the sun is, you know, maybe sort of matching up, and actually we'll drop down the exposure to say 0.25, turn on our scene plate, and you know, I think maybe actually it's pretty good, so we can go with this, and then we'll just put the exposure back up, and I'll actually put this at 2 this time, maybe 3. Yeah, 3 is actually a little bit better, I think. And what actually we'll do now with the shadow material, so we'll go there and just maybe bring the occlusion intensity up, so we've got a bit of a stronger shadow under the car, and you know, we'll render this separately, so in post we can sort of color correct this. As you can see, like the shadows on the here have a little bit of a blue tint, whereas under the car it's quite dark. And so what we'll do next is create a light, so we can use this as a more sort of direct light to get the long shadow on the car and sort of give it a bit more accurate shadows and render that. So what we're going to do now is add in our sunlight. So what we'll do is we'll go to our scene and go to create light, and then choose directional light, and what we can do is just sort of move that up and then move it back a little bit sort of to where our sun might be, and then just give it some rotation so we can start seeing a shadow appear. And what I'll actually do is just go into my transform and do it this way, as it, for me, it's a bit easier than using the gizmo. And we can change the length of our shadow by adjusting the rotation here. And so what we'll do, because we want to try and match the direction of the sun with the back plate, we can go to create geometry, and then we'll just create a cylinder, and we'll make this say 10 meters, and then by 100, and then what we'll do is just rotate this 90 degrees, so it's standing upright like this. And then we want to kind of, you know, bring it into where this lamppost might be, and you know, get an idea of where that shadow may be. So right now you can see it's probably a bit further away than the car than it would be in real life, so say maybe around here or something, and then we can also just bring it up into the shadow plane. And actually I want to take it out of the directional light down here because it will have the transformation. So we can bring this out, just put in a root, and then we can transform it again. So 90 degrees. Move just to origin, and then we can sort of place it on the ground or thereabouts. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but just sort of get an idea of where this might be on the wheel space. So maybe about here. And if we head back into our camera, and then we can move it just a little bit, and then sort of something like that. This will work. So we can go back into our directional light and then play around with the rotation again, and then, you know, even if it's just parallel, this should be okay. So we can get rid of this, and then we'll go back into our directional light and play around with the settings so we can get a sort of smoother shadow. I'll just get rid of these, and there we can change our ground shadow intensity to sort of match the shadow here. And as I said previously, when we go into post, we can sort of color correct the shadow on the floor so it has this sort of blue tint to match the back plate. But I think for now, shadow looks good on the car. And then what we'll do next is go in and add some extra lights, you know, just to brighten up parts like the diffuser here and maybe give some nice reflections on the wheels. Okay, so what we're going to do next is add in a couple more lights around the car, just as I said, to give it some nice reflections, show off a little bit of the body shapes and various parts like the rear diffuser and just the wheels that are in the shadow. So what we're going to do is first create a rectangular light and then just bring that to the back of the car here and bring it up a little bit and maybe sort of move it so you start to see the reflection in the diffuser. And then we're going to scale it up a bit, so I think maybe 800, and then we can just have a look to see whereabouts this is in the space. So maybe actually we can bring this down to maybe 400 and sort of bring it out and maybe just rotate a little bit to point it upwards, and then you can find our camera again. And so what we'll do is also we'll add a gradient just to give it a nice little fall off. So we'll go into our use texture and then choose our gradient light, or gradient map, sorry, and then just add that into the scene. Okay, so what we're going to do next is add in a couple more lights around the car, just as I said, to give it some nice reflections, show off a little bit of the body shapes and various parts like the rear diffuser and just the wheels that are in the shadow. So what we're going to do is first create a rectangular light and then just bring that to the back of the car here and bring it up a little bit and maybe sort of move it so you start to see the reflection in the diffuser. And then we're going to scale it up a bit, so I think maybe 800, and then we can just have a look to see whereabouts this is in the space. So maybe actually we can bring this down to maybe 400 and sort of bring it out and maybe just rotate a little bit to point it upwards, and then you can find our camera again. And so what we'll do is also we'll add a gradient just to give it a nice little fall off. So we'll go into our use texture and then choose our gradient light, or gradient map, sorry, and then just add that into the scene. Look at our light and we can see it needs to be rotated a little bit, so we can actually go into our rotation and then just find 90 degrees is the right one. So back to our camera. And what I'll do is turn off primary visibility, and then I'm just going to play around with the intensity, so maybe something like 0.25, something like that, or yeah, maybe 0.3, and perhaps we could increase the scale a little bit more and maybe sort of move it a little bit this way and also further into the car and or further out. Yeah, maybe something like that will look good. So as you can see, it just brings out a little bit more shape inside the diffuser. You can see it a little bit more clearly. So in fact, maybe we'll bring this down to like 0.15 just to make it a little bit more subtle. You don't want it too obvious. It doesn't look realistic, but I think a nice 0.1, 0.15 makes it look nice and subtle. So that's our first light, and then what we'll do next is create a couple of disc lights for the wheels, just to bring out a bit more shape or have a nice little reflection in there. So we'll do that next, and we can start that by creating some disc light. So we'll go into create and then disc light, and actually we'll make sure that inside our graph we are not inside the light, so we don't get the transformation of the rectangular light. So we'll just go to our root and then again create light, and then just create disc light. And what we'll do here is just drag that out and around about here. That looks alright, and then we'll just sort of rotate this 90 degrees, or I think minus 90, and then we'll just increase the scale, maybe 200, not 20, but 200, something like that. As you can see, you're already starting to see some the bit more detail brought out into the rims. And so what we'll do then is, again, we'll go use the texture, and this time we'll just use a gradient, circular gradient, like we did for the floor previously. And then we'll just go into our intensity and bump it up, so around 200. We'll turn this bloom and glare off in the camera, so we don't get any of that stuff. And then you can just see an idea of what the light is actually doing. So maybe we can just bring it down a bit, maybe increase the scale a little bit, and then maybe, of course, again, just you want it nice and subtle. You don't want to be looking unrealistic, so something like that. And then of course we can go to our primary visibility, turn it off, and we don't want to cast shadow on the shadow material. I think we can actually bring the intensity down a little bit more. So it's very subtle, but I think it just adds a little bit more shape. And again, we can just duplicate this with Control D and then drag this to the front. And again, we'll just pump up the strength, and we can see what it's doing here. Maybe increase the size a little bit, or the scale. I think we can go with maybe 250 by 250 and 250. And of course just drop down the intensity again to something like 1.2 or 1.25. And what you will see is that the light is actually reflecting in the car paint, so we can create a light link set, and then we'll just call this front real reflection. And then we can drop our light in there, and actually we'll give this a better name. So front right wheel reflection, and then this is our rear wheel reflection, and then here we can give diffuser reflection. So and then we can actually go into our C nodes, and you see the light has disappeared. So what we want to do is select this rim. So unfortunately I think all these are separate parts, so it's very difficult to select. But what we can do is, I think we actually need to unlock this selection. So at the moment it's not selectable. We can just go there, and then I think we can select by the material, which is here, chrome matte. And it doesn't matter that we have everything selected, so we can just drag and drop that into C nodes. And then you can see already that the light is now reflecting in the front rim. So we go back to our camera, and you can see that the light is working with a light link set. So, and actually what I want to do is, I think maybe blue paint would look a bit better, so I'm just going to change the paint to blue. And yeah, I like that a little bit more, so I think that looks good. So now we have a bit more shape, as you can see in the diffuser, and a bit more of shape in the front rims as well. And one other thing you can do actually is maybe we can take the rectangular light that we created in the back, so in the diffuser, and we can maybe actually just duplicate this and then bring this around here and actually turn on primary visibility and bring this round. I think actually in the transform we can take that off and just sort of bring it to the side of the car here and maybe push it under a little bit like this, and we could actually make this a bit longer. Go back to our camera. And sometimes you'll get these kind of things that people will add sort of planes like white sheets or black sheets, depending what kind of a reflection that they want to see. So we can just turn up the intensity, and we can see what it does there. So if I can diffuser reflection, there we go, we can see. And this is a nice way to get a bit more shape or more reflection in the side panels, especially if you're doing studio shots, and you can move it around and you can see how it affects the reflection. But I think for now this should be okay. But yeah, you would do something like this if there was some like sharp lines that you wanted to see inside the door panels or something like this. But I think for now we'll just leave it as it is. And so next I think we could actually render this now. We can set up the passes, but first of all I think this shot would be a little bit better if there was actually motion in it. So what we can do next is head into Photoshop, and I can show you how we can blur the back plates to give it sort of like a realistic motion blur, as if the camera is on the rig. And we'd also want to blur the HDRI actually, because if you think about it, that there's another car driving along with a camera at the same speed as the car that we're wanting to take a picture of. You see the reflections that they're also moving, so the motion blur would be applied there, and that's one thing that you don't want to forget, so you get a nice realistic motion blur. So now that we're inside Photoshop, what we can do is first we can convert the backplate to a smart object, and then we're going to head to filter, and then we're going to go to blur, and then we're going to go to path blur. And then what you'll see is you have one blue arrow that's basically pointing the direction of the blur. So for example, what we can do is pull arrow like this, and then generally things further away are not moving as fast, so we can take away the speed all the way down here, and then on this point, we want to keep the speed up here, and then on this endpoint we can bring it all the way down. So as you can see, things closer to the camera now are blurrier than they are in the further away, so we can also add another line here, so we get a sort of correct direction, and we can actually place it off screen. Again, we can bring this down, and also another line here. So basically we're just following the perspective lines of the scene, and bring this down, and then again maybe another one here, but this one actually we can probably delete this. And then for the ground here, we kind of want to basically just try and follow for the line, so we can have a bit more accurate, so it doesn't look like it's curling. So again, we can bring this down, maybe just add one more in, maybe sort of around here like this. And of course you can spend a bit more time dialing it in just to get it a bit more accurate, but for now this should be okay. And of course, what you also like to do in the background, I'd say this one's a bit more trickier, as you know, what you see over here, I guess, is, you know, also not so blurry, and you can sort of bring that down, and you will get some sort of weird artifacts. So you know what you can do is just maybe mask out these sort of areas right way in the background, but for now I'm just going to leave that as it is, and then I'm just going to press OK, and you know, that'll do for now. And I'll actually duplicate the layer and delete this smart filter, and then I'm going to create a mask, and what I'm going to do is just blur out or mask out, you know, the background, so it's not so blurry. So now that I've masked that out, you can see in the background there's still some motion blur. I just played around with the settings just to sort of slow it down as you would, and then just made, you know, a quick mask to blur out, you know, the people in the background and also the lamppost, you know, so it was nicely sort of separated between those. And I think maybe there's a little bit we can fix here, but as I said, you can play around with the values, you know, really dial it in and get a nice sort of motion blur. And yeah, so what we can do now is we save this new backplate, and then we'll add it into the scene, and then we'll work on adding motion blur to the wheels. So I went ahead and added the backplate in, and now we can work out how we can create some motion blur on the wheels. And so what I did was create a few groups just of the wheels. So we have front right rotation, front left rotation, and basically we can then, you know, give them some rotation. But as you can see here, sometimes you have to go to move to rotation pivot and then move object to center, and out of habit I just add also do it with the scale, so I can go through each one of those. Scale and pivot, move to object center, rotation pivot, rotation pivot, rotation pivot. So now you can see if I am rotating these wheels now, they should spin around the center of the wheel. So we can go back out of isolation mode, and what we can do is go to our curves, and I already set up the rear rotation, but I will show you how we can, you know, set it up for also the rest of the wheel. So what I do here, we'll go to this is the rear right rotation that I've already done. So we'll go to our front left and our rear left, and we also have our front right. So we'll do our front right, and what we'll just do is we'll add it here a keyframe at frame 0. We're actually at frame 5, so we'll go to frame 0, delete this key, and then just key the frame, and then we'll go to frame 10, and then we'll just rotate this on the y-axis 360 degrees, and also just key that, and then we'll go to frame 5, and yeah, now you can see that the front wheels and the back wheels rotating. So we'll do the rest of the wheels, and then we'll talk about the camera settings. So now that we've got all the wheels keyframed and spinning, we can go into our camera settings. So we'll open our camera window and just go into our perspective, and then we can enable motion blur. And you know, we have some presets here, so you can choose, obviously, if you want to keep something still, you'd want a fast shutter speed, whereas if you wanted to keep the shutter open a bit longer, obviously for moving cars and things like this, then you can choose this. So what I'm going to do here is just, I'm going to say okay, shutter speed maybe 10, and then you can see the wheels are spinning and it looks like the car is now moving. So that's how we can add motion blur to the wheels. And there's one last thing to do, which is to add motion blur to the sphere. So we can do this in Photoshop, similar way to we did the backplate, so that's what we'll do next. Okay, so now that we have our HDRI in Photoshop, what we can do is the same as what we did with the backplate. So I'll just convert this to a smart object. Now once we have our smart object, we can go again to our blur gallery and then to our path blur. And this time we have to create a few more lines that are sort of, they meet in the middle. So here obviously we want it to be fast, and over here we want it to be slow. So we can change our endpoint speed here, and then we'll just create another one that will sort of follow the road here, and then once it's in the distance, we'll turn this right down to 0 again. So what we're seeing on these ones, we want sort of a similar speed, and sometimes it's a bit difficult to select the ones you want, so you just have to play around, and then you just keep sort of trying to match what you see in the lines in the road. So you can do something like that, and there you go, have the pin here, and then just make sure everything at the sort of in the distance doesn't have any motion blur. I mean, you probably won't notice anyway, but it helps a little bit. So you can do it this way, and it's a bit fiddly at times, but it will take a few attempts to get the right way. But yeah, I think we can delete this path because it's not working the way I want. So it's like similar to using your pen tool, and then you just click to end it. So that's what we'll do here, and then we select our endpoint and just make sure that we blur this. And I'm going to do this for the rest, so we have a nice blurred HDRI, and then we'll get back into VRED and check it out. So now that we're back inside VRED, we can load our blurred HDRI. So I'll just find this and load it in. And if you pay attention to the door here, you should see a little bit of a change now. It's a bit, what you saw before, there was gaps, I think, in the barrier, but you can no longer see them. So it's looking a bit better and a little bit more realistic. So now we can actually move on to rendering this, because everything else is finished. We've done our lights, we've blurred our backplate, we've blurred our sphere, and we have some nice camera effects. I mean, you could maybe even just add a little movement to the car, so get some sort of motion blur in there, so it's not 100% sharp, as it wouldn't be in real life. So what we can do now is we can talk about our render settings and how we're going to render this out. So what we can do is we can open our render settings tab, and first of all I want to go to my file output, and what I will do is basically just set my file path. So I will create a new folder, and I will just call this exterior, and then I will give it a name, so velocity version 1, something like that, and I will make it an EXR, and we'll save this. And now we have got our path set, and we set our image size to what our backplate size would be, and we want to keep the same aspect ratio, otherwise the render window will get stretched, and yeah, this just can lead to the car not looking right and things like this. So ideally you want to keep the image size the same as your backplate, and a render mode for global illumination, production render, quality, super sampling on, yes. We want to export the alpha channel. Want personal preference, I keep this on, and you can also export this as HDR format, export EXR in 16-bit instead of 32-bit, and I think actually we'll go with 16-bit because we'll convert it to 16-bit anyway. And also we can export like an OpenEXR or a PSD file, but I'm just going to keep all the passes separate for now. And when it comes to the color channels, I usually just tick everything except for translucency, background color, and transparency color, but for now we'll have everything on. We'll keep our lens flares. We don't need a backplate. We'll keep ambient occlusion, and we'll have our normal maps and our material IDs. And quickly we can talk about material IDs. For example, with our car paint, we can go all the way down to our ray tracing, and we have this already set to material ID as 1. So if we check out our render pass rendering and then we get to auxiliary channels and material ID, you can see now that we can, all the car paint is red, the tiles are this kind of bluish color, and we could possibly, you know, set the wheels to 2, to the rims, and then maybe just the glass to something like 3, and then this sort of glass here, set this to 4, and I think actually this one here is carbon, so, and it's not car paint, so we'll change this to 5. So this stands, there we go. So now you can see that we've all got our material ID set. We can go back to realistic rendering. And what I'm actually going to do quickly is I'm going to create a render layer for the shadow. So we want to go to our render layer. So I think it's rendering, render layer. I'm just going to create a new set, create a new layer, and then I'm going to just add in the shadow plane into the layer, and I'm going to turn this visible off. So it's still there. I think actually, sorry, turn primary visibility off, and you see it's still reflecting in the car, but it's invisible to the camera now, because we want to grade the shadow separately. It's easier to render it separately, so we're just going to render the car. So that's everything set up. General settings, use image samples 512, or you can use time, and then I just keep most of this default. So the same with ray tracing quality, we want full glow illumination, and that should be good. So we can render, and then we can take a look at the passes when we have finished. So now that the render's finished, you can see that we've got our layers in Photoshop, and I also rendered the shadow. We used the same technique as the car, so we created the render layer, added the car, and just set the primary visibility to off, and so we just had a shadow, as you can see here. So we'll just quickly go through the layers and what rendered, but as you can see we have the transparency color here, which is basically your refraction. We have our translucency, which we don't need, so we can delete that because it's just black. Yes, we don't want that. We have our specular reflection, which we want, our occlusion, our normals, our material IDs. We have our lens flares, which you can't really see at the moment, so maybe we can just add these here, but unfortunately they don't seem to be there. And that will because we actually have a bloom and glare, and it's not a lens flare so we don't need that. We have incandescence, so we don't have any. We have a glossy light, which you can see on the rims. You have the indirect, the IBL, diffuse light, which we don't have any of, diffuse indirect, and we have our diffuse IBL, so that's our paint. So what we'll do is we'll just bring that down to the bottom, along with our diffuse and indirect lights. And then what we'll do, we'll just change those modes to linear dot add, and then we'll add our specular reflection, also blending mode linear dot add, and then we'll bring our glossy, and actually we'll put that underneath the specular and have the specular on top, and then we can select all those just to make sure, and that's linear dot add, and now we should have something that sort of resembles the beauty, but of course we have our transparency layer, which again we just have to set to linear dot add, and then our shadow, which we can turn on, as you can see, and then the next step would be to bring in our backplate. So we can find our backplate, and then we can go from there. So it's looking all right there. So very tight in there. So that's looking all right, and then now we want to sort of try and balance the color so it matches the shadow by the lamppost, and then what we can do is create a solid color. And then we'll just give this sort of a light bluish, something like this. And then we can set the mode to hue. And then what I'm going to do is select the shadow and then just use this as a layer mask. So then you can see now we have a little shadow matches up a little bit, and we can just sort of play around with the opacity of the solid color, and then we can see that our shadow is matching a little bit better now, and it looks a bit more accurate. And then what we can do next is just take a look at the other passes that we rendered. So we have our occlusion pass that we can just get a little more darker in the sort of the occluded areas. So we just set this to multiply, and then we just drop down the opacity to something like 25%. Then we have our material IDs, which is self-explanatory. If you want to make changes to the paint and the paint only, you can just select the red, or if you want to make changes to the wheels, then you can just select the green channel. So we can do it that way. And then our last channel is a normal channel. It's pretty interesting because we can use this to actually affect or change the lighting on the car itself. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate everything, and then I'm going to crunch all of these layers into one with Control E, and then I'm going to duplicate these into a new layer. Oops, I don't want to delete the layers. I want to duplicate them, and then we'll just make a new document. And in this document, what I'm going to do is change the mode to 16-bit. I press no to merge, and then here we can actually go to select color range, and then we can pick colors, say for around here, maybe bring up the fuzziness a little bit. Press OK, and then you can see it's made a selection here. So we hide this layer, and then we can just go and add a curves layer, adds the mask, and then you can add a bit more light in the back of the car if you want to, and then you can do this all over the car basically. So that's a really nice pass to have, and yeah, as you can see now, that's our render's looking good, and it matches our VRED view, and that's how we can put all the passes together and make it look like our VRED view, and then we can comp this in whatever software that we choose.